Last week, we discussed the first witchcraft trial in America that took place in Virginia. And by popular request, let's bring it full circle and discuss the last known witchcraft trial, at least in the state of Virginia. A story of a misunderstood woman, targeted for her independence and grit. A typical case of 18th century witchcraft trials, but sprinkled with a bit of supernatural events that just simply can't be ignored. The last recorded witchcraft trial in the state of Virginia. The only recorded trial of a witch ducking in the state of Virginia. And the story of one's survival and legacy that she left behind. Today, we look at the story of Grace Sherwood, the Witch of Pungo. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. Grace White Sherwood was born in the year 1660, daughter to Scottish descendant John White and Susan White of English descent. Most historians agree that Grace was probably born in the Pungo area of Virginia. Records from the Lynnhaven Parish Church states that in April of 1680, Grace White married farmer James Sherwood. The new couple received 50 acres of land on the banks of Muddy Creek from Grace's father, James, as a wedding gift. Then another inherited 145 acres a year later when James White passed away in 1681. Despite the large amount of land now owned by the Sherwoods, they were poor by all standards, as was their surrounding community. Even so, the Sherwoods operated their farm and went on to have 3 children, John, James, and Richard. On top of farming, Grace Sherwood worked as a midwife and a healer, growing her own herbs on their land that she used in her medicinal mixtures. The couple were together for a little over 20 years, but then in 1701, her husband James passed away, and Grace inherited the entire property. Grace chose to never remarry. Grace Sherwood continued with the operation of the family farm, but a large focus of her work remained in working as a healer. It was during this time that evil began to rear its head, but not that of witchcraft, and not from Grace herself. Instead, it was the women of the surrounding community, and the evil was in the form of jealousy. There are no surviving paintings or such of Grace Sherwood, but most accounts and stories describe her as a tall and attractive woman with a great sense of humor, making it pretty easy for the men of the community to be more than willing to offer the widow any help when it was needed. This naturally made the other wives and girlfriends jealous of Grace, and with the poverty of the small community, those that were not jealous of Grace's good looks would have been easily jealous of her land holdings. It was natural for talk to start up around anything peculiar when it pertained to Grace Sherwood. Something that's pointed out as strange, at least for the day, was the fact that Grace preferred to wear pants rather than dresses, especially when working in her own fields. It was more of an oddity than anything else, and something that stirred curiosity more than anything, and probably made the men of the community view Grace on a more level playing field with themselves over the other women of Pungo, which was only fuel to the fire. In short time, the strong, independent Grace Sherwood found herself battling at least a dozen documented lawsuits, most of them putting her in the position of defending herself against accusations of witchcraft, but not all of them. Some of those lawsuits were instituted by Grace herself. She was not afraid of flipping the script and going after someone for slander. The first claim against Grace was brought to court in 1697 by Mr. Richard Capps. He claimed that Grace had used a spell to kill his bull. The courts in Virginia found no evidence of this, though, and Grace was found not guilty. Grace responded with a countersuit for slander against Mr. Capps, and the case was settled outside of court. The following year, in 1698, another accusation was made by Mr. John Gisburn, saying that Grace had put a spell on his cotton plants and herd of pigs. This time, Grace immediately responded with a slander lawsuit before the trial could even begin, and both cases were dismissed by the courts. Later that same year, Elizabeth Barnes accused Grace of shape-shifting into a black cat, getting into the Barnes home, whipping Elizabeth, then escaping the home by crawling through a keyhole. The courts basically rolled their eyes and said, "Prove it," and Elizabeth could not. The case was dismissed, as well as Grace's follow-up defamation lawsuit. Things were taking their toll, though, as Grace would be responsible for paying court costs for all of her follow-up battles. In 1705, Grace found herself in court again, this time on a case she started. According to records, Grace Sherwood and Elizabeth Hill had gotten into a physical fight, and Grace brought charges of assault and battery against both Elizabeth Hill and her husband. With this case, Grace won and was awarded 20 shillings. Anyone familiar with these timelines, especially outside of the American South, will notice that these accusations began just 5 years after the infamous Salem witchcraft trials, where 30 people were found guilty of witchcraft and 19 were executed over the short course of only 15 months. So why was Grace faring so much better in her cases? Well, it seems that location is everything. Unlike the religious-influenced courts of New England, the South, and Virginia in particular, the courts were more influenced by folklore and folk beliefs. New England found ministers taking an active role in all court battles, where the religious leaders in Virginia had other matters to deal with. With the poverty of the South, religious leaders were more focused on keeping down social issues such as gossip, slander, and fornication, something they viewed as threats to social stability. And even though accusations of witchcraft typically found their way into the gossip and slander side of things, Virginia still had a different approach with these cases. The biggest difference was that New England required the accused to prove their innocence, and Virginia required the accuser to prove their claims. New England would accept evidence gathered by supernatural means, where Virginia mostly ignored anything outside of physical evidence. For the most part, though, officials in Virginia tried to steer clear of any trial involving accusations of witchcraft, as they viewed these cases as being divisive to the community. Cases of witchcraft were mostly seen by the courts as simply troublesome and a waste of their time. There were instances where cases were forced, though, as people would remind them that, according to the law of the day, Witchcraft was illegal in the colony of Virginia, after all. Here, poverty comes into the equation again, because the area around present-day Norfolk and Virginia Beach, the area where today's story took place, saw more accusations of witchcraft than any other in Virginia. The belief now being that because the area was so poor, there were no social or cultural elites to hold back or discourage those prosecutions. During the 17th century, this area saw 19 witchcraft trials, and all but one resulted in an acquittal or not guilty. The one case where a guilty verdict was passed involved a man accused of witchcraft, and his sentence was 10 lashes and being kicked out of the community. Things continued for Grace Sherwood, though, and by this time, the courts in Virginia were growing tired of it, viewing Grace as a nuisance in the community. On January 3, 1706, Elizabeth Hill, the same woman that had been charged with the physical assault of Grace Sherwood a year earlier, brought new charges of witchcraft against Grace, saying Grace had used a spell to cause Elizabeth to have a miscarriage. This time, for unknown reasons, Grace Sherwood failed to show up to court to answer to these charges, so things proceeded to trial. In February, the courts created 2 juries, one to search the home of Grace Sherwood for any evidence that would prove that she was a witch, and the other jury was instructed to search Grace herself, looking for any physical mark to prove that she was a witch. Both juries refused to carry out those searches. In March, the courts created a new jury, comprised of 12, quote, ancient and knowing women. They were ordered to search Grace Sherwood's body for any markings that would prove her to be a witch. This time, they complied and reported finding, quote, 2 marks not like theirs or like those of any other woman. I think it's important to note here, though, that the jury forewoman was Elizabeth Barnes, who had brought witchcraft claims against Grace back in 1698, claiming that Grace had the ability to shapeshift into a cat and crawl through keyholes. Still, though, the local authorities were reluctant to call Grace a witch. They called the charges and evidence overly vague and referred the case to a larger court, one where Grace was forced to travel 16 miles for each and every court appearance. On May the 2nd, 1706, the court found that even though there was no wrongdoing found, there was a, quote, great cause of suspicion. The sheriff of Princess Anne County took Grace into custody, and with the consent of Grace Sherwood herself, a trial of ducking was ordered to take place on July 5th, 1706, where the accused would be bound and thrown into the water. The belief was that a witch would float because the purity of water itself would repel the evilness of witchcraft. The downfall, though, in this belief was that the innocent would sink. The date of the trial came, but was ultimately postponed due to heavy rains, saying that the wet weather would jeopardize Grace's health. But 5 days later, on July the 10th, 1706, the trial resumed. Then 46-year-old Grace Sherwood was taken into Lynn Haven Parish Church and ordered to ask for forgiveness. Her reply was, "I be not a witch, I be a healer." Records then state that at 10 a.m. that very same day, Grace was taken down the road to the mouth of the Lynn Haven River. News had spread over the days, and a large crowd had gathered, chanting, "Duck the witch." There, women from the church stripped Grace of her clothes and covered her with a sack. 6 court justices rowed out 200 yards into the river, followed by another boat that contained the sheriff, the court magistrate, and Grace Sherwood. The weather was normal, and under a clear blue sky, Grace Sherwood stood up in the boat and proclaimed, "Before this day be through, you will all get a worse ducking than I." She was then bent over and bound, tying her left thumb to her right big toe, and her right thumb to her left big toe, and then thrown from the boat, immediately floating to the surface. The sheriff then pulled her from the water, tied a reported 13-pound Bible around her neck, and threw her back in, causing her to sink like a stone. But with this, Grace was able to untie herself and swam back to the surface unharmed. The crowds on the bank of the river were in an uproar, screaming accusations that this proved that she was a witch. The sheriff pulled her back aboard the small rowboat, and as the chaos of the crowd grew and grew, Grace cut an angry stare on them, and the sky immediately grew dark. A relentless downpour rained down on them all, while thunder and lightning caused the mob to scatter for their own safety. Grace Sherwood was returned to jail to await further proceedings, making Grace Sherwood the only person tried by water for witchcraft in the history of Virginia. What exactly happened to Grace after that isn't fully known. A lot of the records surrounding her have been lost, but it is known that she spent time in the jail next door to the Lynnhaven Parish Church, and most historians tend to agree that she was there for about 7 years at max. We do know that she was ordered to be held for a future trial, but records of any more trials simply don't exist. It's thought that she was released somewhere in 1714 or before, because records do show her paying property tax on her property back in Pungo. As far as surviving records show, Grace Sherwood lived the rest of her life quietly and out of any more trouble back home in Pungo, where she eventually passed away in 1740 at the age of 80. The exact date isn't known, but it's believed to be either August or September. Her will was read in court on October 1st, 1740, where she left 5 shillings to her sons James and Richard, and everything else went to her oldest son, John. Even with this, the impact of Grace Sherwood would not be done within the community of Pungo. According to the stories that were passed down through generations, the Sherwood sons had the body of their mother placed near the fireplace while they prepared for the funeral. That night, a strong wind came down the chimney, and the body of Grace Sherwood disappeared amongst the swirling ash and embers, and when the dust had settled, Grace Sherwood's body was again there, along with a single cloven hoof print left behind in the scattered ash. Grace Sherwood was buried in a wooded area in an unmarked grave, near the intersection of Pungo Ferry Road and Princess Anne Road in what is now Virginia Beach. In the days that followed her burial, the area was plagued with unnatural storms, and feral black cats began staying around her grave. The townspeople were unnerved by this, and the men took to killing each and every cat that was found near her grave, leading to the historic recording of the great mice and rat infestation of Prince Anne County in 1743. The stories of Grace Sherwood stayed with the community, and even her house continued to stand for over 200 years, despite repeated attempts of burning it down by vandals and others alike. Eventually, though, it was lost in 2002, after standing defiant for centuries, leaving only the brick chimneys that were eventually bulldozed to the ground in November of 2002. The only trace of the Sherwood home now is a few left behind bricks and part of its foundation. The property itself is now part of the Back Bay National Wildlife Refuge. In recent years, modern historians have dug as deep as they can into the stories around Grace Sherwood. One in particular, Belinda Nash, compiled her research into a biography of Sherwood and began advocating to clear Grace's name. And on July 10th, 2006, at exactly 10 a.m., the exact 300th anniversary of her conviction, Governor Tim Kaine granted Grace Sherwood a full pardon. A statue of Grace Sherwood was put in place near the spot of her ducking at nowadays Centaura Bayside Hospital, showing Grace with a raccoon and a basket of herbs. A historic marker now stands 25 yards from the statue, marking the place of the ducking and the story of Grace Sherwood. In 2014, a memorial was placed at an herb garden outside Old Donation Episcopal Church, the historical building being Grace's former parish in Virginia Beach. The local legend there being that all of the rosemary growing there came from a single plant that Grace's mother brought with her as a seed, carried in an eggshell, all the way from England. Since 2006, annual reenactments of the ducking of Grace Sherwood have taken place at the original location, although no actual people are truly ducked in the reenactments. But according to locals, they are careful to get every detail exactly right, because each July, a strange moving light appears over the spot, now named Witch Duck Bay, where Grace Sherwood was first thrown into the water. Locals believe this to be the spirit of Grace herself, perhaps happy that her name has now been cleared, and returns to the spot to see her legacy remembered, or maybe overseeing things, just to make sure they get it right.